Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me here. This is it's fun to come to these things. The topic that I'm going to talk about today is to be or not to be, the basics of canola pollination. Now, I'm originally from Vancouver, so when I came here in 2014, I was surprised to see that there's veritable oceans of canola everywhere out here. And I've spent the last 3 years working on my PhD on how canola is pollinated, and how bees benefit from canola, and how canola can benefit from bees. So I'm going to talk to you a bit in this talk about how canola is pollinated, who and what pollinates canola, is any extra pollination necessary for your fields, and what can you do to support this whole process. So actually, just a quick question. By a show of hands, who here has grown canola? Okay, so you're all very familiar about what the plant is. So I'm mainly going to be talking about Argentine canola in this talk. There is also Polish canola, which is Brassica rapa, but I'm mainly focusing on Argentine canola. So canola is also known as oilseed rape. It's in the family Brassicaceae, which is the family of broccoli and turnips and things like that. It's Canada's biggest cash crop. So it's in 2013 it was $7.3 billion. There are both what are called hybrid and open pollinated forms of it. Most people grow hybrid in the folks that I've talked to, in southern Alberta anyway. Most of them tend to grow hybrid canola. But there's also a small market for open pollinated or traditional canola. And another interesting thing is that this was created in Canada. So canola was bred back in Manitoba back in the 1960s. And canola itself means Canadian oil low acid. So it's a portmanteau of those several words in there. So now let's take a look at a little bit of the details there. You've seen these big, large yellow fields, and most of you have probably seen what canola flowers look like up close too. Well, these are the naughty bits of the canola flower here. So it's the male and the female parts. Now, if you recall from sort of high school biology, perfect flowers have a female part and a male part. So they have the stigma, which is the female part, and the anthers, which produce pollen. Now, as you can see from this diagram here, there's arrows going to both to the same plant and then to another plant. So this represents both cross and self-pollination. So self-pollination is where the plant is able to pollinate itself and create seeds by that. And cross-pollination is where it goes to another plant. Now, self-pollination can create some problems in some plants. For instance, Polish canola has a self-incompatibility mechanism, so it cannot actually self-pollinate. And that has some benefits because you can get lower inbreeding depression going on. Similar to why you don't breed very close stock lines in animal breeding. Then you can also get benefits from outbreeding as well, which is where you have crosses between the two plants. So that's commodity canola. That's probably what most of you have grown. Who here has grown seed canola before? Okay, so smaller number. Now, seed canola is an interesting system, and it's actually grown in a very specific region of Alberta, just sort of south of Brooks, down to kind of around where Tabor is. There's this sort of a very thin triangle where most of the seed canola for all of Canada is grown there. So it's a smaller proportion of the acreage, about 50,000 acres in total. And in these plants, they have the seed companies that produce this have a sterility trait that they use in these plants to control the parentage of the plants. So in the terminology of Jerry Springer, they do know who the father is. And then this is used by seed companies to create hybrid seed for the next season. So the seeds that come from a seed canola field will be sold to growers during the next year for planting. Now, most of you probably have seen things similar to this, but there's planting goes on in bays. So now let's see if there we go. So we have the female bay and the male bay, or for those of you on that side of the room, female bay and the male bay. And they are grown in these long strips in these fields. And so you recall how I said that there's a sterility trait that goes on in the flowers. Well, this is actually what it looks like. So the sterility trait turns off anther production. So these flowers on the right here, or these female flowers, they have no anthers, so they cannot self-pollinate, and that means that all of the pollen that comes to that stigma has to be from the male plant. And the reason they do this is because you get what's called hybrid vigor going on in the next generation if you produce, or if you have cross-pollination from two distinct lines. And that forms what is known as hybrid canola. So does anyone see any kind of advantages to not having the anthers going on here? Well, that's because there's no, again, you know who the father is. It has to be these female, or it has to be these male plants, that it can't pollinate itself. So that means you get a very controlled cross going on there. So to kind of summarize, commodity canola, it is capable of self-pollination, and they're usually not stocked with pollinators. And commodity canola is grown all across the US and Canada. It's grower controlled, meaning that you have autonomy over your own operation during that season. And about 20 million acres of commodity canola are grown over all of Canada. Seed canola is a bit of a different system because it cannot self-pollinate, and it's usually heavily stocked with pollinators. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the second part of the talk, is who are the pollinators of this. And it's mainly grown in Alberta, aside from a couple parental lines that are grown in other places. But it is company controlled, so that the growers sign contracts with the seed companies that they will grow it in precisely this way for the next year, and then they are reimbursed quite handsomely for it. But then there's a proportionally smaller acreage of this. All right. So now we know sort of how the pollination systems in canola work here. Now I'm going to talk about who's doing all the dirty work here. So we have the first one off, and this is what most people are familiar with, is honeybees. So honeybees their Latin name is Apis mellifera, which literally means just bee honey making in Latin. And they're originally from Italy. So that's sort of something that most people don't realize, is that honeybees are not from North America. In fact, there are no North American species of honeybees. They're all from Europe. So the breeds that we mainly use are from Italy and from Germany, and they were imported with European settlers. Now, these are one of the most common pollinators used across North America, just because their colony sizes are so large, so they can make up to 50,000 workers in a large-sized colony, and because of the design of the Langstroth hives, which are those boxes that you sometimes see on the side of the road, they can be moved around very easily. So that makes it sort of an ideal movable pollinator operation here. So the way that it works here in southern Alberta is you can purchase packages. So packages is about a pound of bees with all the workers. And usually the queen is in a little box in the middle. You can purchase them from New Zealand, and then they come in the mail, and then the post office calls you and says, "Hello, your bees are here. Please come get them." And you can also buy queens too. So queens are generally made in Hawaii, and because of the long growing season there, that's why most of the queens are made in Hawaii. And the bees around here are reared on early flowers. So the flowers that first come out in the spring are things like dandelion and caragana. And what goes on at first is that the bees will bring back nectar and pollen, and they'll feed that to their kids. So the kids are the larvae that live in the cells, and then the larvae take about 21 days to make, and then they pop out and become adult bees that carry on the work. And then the actual honey that comes from these colonies gets collected on later flowers. So once the hive has built up its workforce, then it's capable of doing huge amounts of work in the surrounding areas. And that's where all the honey gets brought in. And that's mainly from things like clover and alfalfa and canola. But then at the end of the season, once the productivity of flowers dies down, the colonies, they reduce their worker force, so a lot of the workers will die off. And then they'll all huddle around the queen to keep her warm, and that's when they live off of the honey that they've stored. Now in southern Alberta, it can get cold as it is today, so a lot of bee producers will overwinter them inside actually. So what they'll do is they'll take what are called the singles, which is the bottom box in those hives. That's the brood chamber. So that's where all of the larvae are stored, and that's where the queen stays. So they take all of those from all of the hives, and they'll put them into climate-controlled barns where they can keep it cool, but not like bitingly cold, so that the bees will stay kind of in a state of hibernation, but not die off from the cold. Or they can also, down this far south, they can actually be overwintered outside too. So often another thing they'll do is they'll wrap them up with landscaping paper in order to keep things out of the hive. So they keep rodents from trying to sneak in and find somewhere warm to overwinter. Okay, so those are honeybees. Most people are pretty familiar with honeybees. We know that they have a queen and they make workers and all this kind of thing. People are somewhat less familiar with this. So this is the alfalfa leafcutter bee. So this is called Megachile rotundata, that's the Latin name. These are also a non-native species, so they're originally from Poland, and they got imported back in the 1960s. And the story of how they got imported was kind of interesting, because seed canola producers realized that honeybees can't actually pollinate, or not seed canola, seed alfalfa producers realized that honeybees cannot pollinate seed alfalfa. So that's just a fact. Honeybees are actually quite picky about it. They'll go around the side of the flower and drink nectar from there, but they won't pollinate it. Whereas these guys are much better at it, so they were imported. And they're used to pollinate seed alfalfa and seed canola. And they are solitary bees. So when most people think about bees, they think, oh, well, there's got to be a queen and workers and drones and all that sort of thing. But these guys are solitary, so they only work for themselves. They have no queen. There are male and female. There are male and female separate bees. So that one in particular, that is a male alfalfa leafcutter bee sitting on that flower there. You can tell they're male because they have really, really long antennae and they have bright green eyes. Now, where you may have seen these is if you've ever done the sort of drive from Medicine Hat over towards Lethbridge through Tabor during the summer, or up Highway 36, you might have seen these sort of orange tents sitting out in the field. Now, these are leafcutter shelters. So this is sort of what they look like on the outside, and then they have these boards that hang down in the inside that are made out of styrofoam. Now, those styrofoam boards have all of these little holes punched in them, and that's where the bees actually go and that's where they lay their eggs. That's where they make their brood, and that's how you get new leafcutter bees for the next year. So this is a close-up picture of it. So you can see this is the board. This is the board here that has all these holes punched in it, and here's a leafcutter coming out of it right now. Now, what they'll do is they'll go out and they'll cut out chunks of leaves from the surrounding area, or if they're in a canola field, they'll even cut out pieces of petals and they'll wrap them up into little kind of cigar-shaped tubes like this, and then the female bee will stuff all of this pollen and nectar into there and lay an egg on it. And then later on during the season, the egg will hatch, the larva will come out, and will eat all that pollen and nectar, go into a pupal stage, and then overwinter as that pupa, right? So this is how reproduction works in leafcutter bees. And then during the next year, then they'll chew their way out of the cocoon and come out and start the whole cycle again. Okay, and the reason that, in these leafcutter, and what leafcutter producers do is they'll keep all of these cocoons in big bins in, again, climate-controlled warehouses and keep them cool but not too cold. And that way they can control when they emerge the next year. So say they need pollination going on first week of July, and they know that it takes 12 days to mature. They'll start cranking up the temperature around 12 days before they start putting them out in the fields. Okay, so there we go. So we have those are the sort of two main commercial pollinators that are used in southern Alberta. Now I'm going to talk a bit more about wild pollinators, because this is something that people I think need to know more about and be more aware of in their operations. So the first one is bumblebees. Now most people know about bumblebees too. They're these big fuzzy things. You can see the queens, these kind of big sort of plum-sized bees buzzing around sort of May and early June looking for nests. But there's about 26 species of bumblebees in Alberta, and they're social bees like honeybees. So they also have a queen. They're not solitary. Now, where they mainly live is in rodent burrows, so like gopher holes, and also in tree cavities too. So if there's a forest there with a bowl where a branch has come off, often you'll find them in there too. They also make honey, but they don't reuse hives. So this is why we don't use these guys for honey production, is because they only make enough for that one season. And you'll see in the next slide just why that is. But keep in mind that bumblebees, they only live for one season, whereas honeybees, they can live for multiple years. So this is the life cycle of a bumblebee. So let's walk through this here. So we start off in the spring when the queen a mated queen is hibernating under the ground in the soil, and then they come out and then they start foraging. So they're looking for food to feed themselves, but also at the same time they're looking for food to set up a new colony. And you can see on the right here, she has found an old rodent burrow or something like that, and she started to make a colony. So what she'll do is she'll make a thing called a honey pot. So that's that sort of jar-shaped thing on the left there, and she'll fill that up with honey and use that to store honey for herself and for her kids during the next year. And then she'll take care of her first brood, and keep in mind she's going in and out, bringing back food for her kids each time. And then once the first set of workers hatches, then she becomes a stay-at-home mom. And then all of her kids start go out and doing the work for her. So her job at that point changes from forager to maintainer of the hive. Okay? So then you can see all of her worker attendants down below her there are looking after her and bringing in food for her and for themselves as well. And then sort of around July, something changes. So she starts to make these big cells here. So those big cells are new reproductives. So workers cannot reproduce. Worker bumblebees cannot reproduce. They're usually much smaller, maybe like a centimeter or smaller. But she starts making reproductives around July. And this is new drones, which are male bees, and new queens. And what will happen is that they will hatch, they will exit the hive, and then they will go on their merry way. They will mate, and then the males will die at the end of the season. But then the mated females will find a log or another hole to hide in for the winter, and will go and hide underground and hibernate for the next year. But then the original hive dies off. So this is why we don't collect. This is the main reason why we don't get any honey from bumblebees, is because they don't store anything for the winter. Whereas honeybees evolved in an environment where they needed to store honey for the whole year. So that's why they do that essentially. Okay, so now we know about those guys. Now this is another one that people are often less familiar with. Are solitary bees. So now most people think of bumblebees, honeybees, and then that's kind of about it. Well, actually, there's about 400 species of solitary bees in Alberta alone, and these guys live in a similar environment. So they live underground in ditch margins or field margins or ditches, coulees, or cavities in wood. And they only live for a couple weeks of the year. So they go through a similar life cycle to the leafcutter bees in that they are solitary, so they don't have a queen, and they're only working for themselves. Except this time they don't have any convenient styrofoam boards to live in. They have to make their own way in the world. So this is a picture of what a solitary bee nest might look like. So on the left here, you'll see that this bee here has dug a tunnel down into the soil, and then at the bottom, she lays an egg with a bunch of pollen and nectar that she's collected down at the bottom. Then the egg will hatch, the larva will eat all of the pollen and nectar, and then the bee will overwinter under the ground like that. And then they'll come out during the next year and start the whole cycle again. Now, so that's a soil nesting bee like Andrina. And I also have a collection of bees at the back of the room if you guys want to see what some of these look like. But then you can also have cavity nesting ones like wild leaf cutters. And they will do the same thing, except they'll bore holes into wood or use existing holes in wood. Or even my girlfriend's parents, they have a doorbell that's where the button fell off, and I found a leafcutter bee building a nest in there when I was over there earlier in the summer. So they'll use anything that's kind of generally hole-shaped that they'll try to build a nest in. Okay, so here's a bit of a summary. So honeybees and leafcutter bees are common managed pollinators in southern Alberta, but there are also hundreds of wild pollinators in Alberta. Now, wild bees nest underground in burrows or in wood or things like that, but the flight range of wild bees is quite small, so it's usually less than a kilometer. In fact, some of the really, really small ones, some of the ones that are maybe only half a centimeter long, they can only fly maybe 100 meters. So their entire world is a circle that's 100 meters wide. So anything that happens in that circle will be crucial to whatever happens to them in their life, whether they're able to survive and whether they're able to make kids for the next generation. All right, so now here comes, so this is the other part of my talk, is how does pollination help me? How can pollination improve yield in commodity canola? Now we know that in seed canola, it's necessary to have pollination. If you don't have it, you have no seed. But in commodity canola, there's some interesting work that's been done in sort of the last 10 years that's looking on how pollination changes yield in commodity canola. And this is usually of interest to most of the growers that I've worked with. So here I'm going to present a couple different papers that from the last 10 years that sort of sparked this research. Now this is from a paper by Sabahi et al. This went on in Quebec. Now on the x-axis here, so the bottom, you can see that this is the number of hives per acre or per hectare. So they stocked these different trial plots with different numbers of bees, and then they looked at how the blooming period of the canola changed. And they found that as you add more honeybees to the plots, then you actually get a reduction in the blooming period. So the canola stops blooming faster. And then some of the other results that they have is that if you have higher pollination in a field, you also get a greater percentage of pod set. So pod set is just the number of flowers that made it to the pod stage. So say you had 100 flowers on a plant and 90 of them made it to pods. Well, that's 90% pod set. So that's all that it's saying. And these guys found that pod set is higher in canola fields where you have honeybees visiting. And finally, well, actually, no. This is no. There's more after this. But so they also found that there was a higher number of seeds per pod too, which makes sense because if you have more bees in a field, you have more transfer pollen going on, and you have have potential for less inbreeding depression going on. So fewer of those seeds would get aborted by the plant. And this is more what people think about is in terms of yield here. And these guys also found that pollinated canola has a greater yield. So these guys found that there was about a 46% increase in their 3 hives per hectare plots in terms of yield, which sounds like quite a lot actually. And then finally, this is another study. This is not by Sabahi et al. This is by Mirandon and Winston, and they did some studies up in northern Alberta near Grand Prairie during the earlier 2000s. And they were looking at proximity to undisturbed land. So this is down here. It would be things like coulees or field margins and things like that. Up there, it's more sort of forested areas. And on the left-hand side, you can see this is a seed deficit. So it's sort of they calculated it in a funny way, but essentially that means it's equivalent to pods per or seeds per pod. And they found that in areas where you have a high bee abundance, you have more seeds per pod, which is essentially what the last study found as well, except up in the piece, it's mainly wild bees. So what these guys were looking at is the ability of wild bees to enhance the value of your crops as well. And they found that the more uncultivated land you have around there, the more wild bees are in your area. And they actually developed a trade-off between having undeveloped area on your land and production. So that was that's kind of interesting in my mind. Now, I don't entirely agree with all of these studies, and I will tell you why. So in the first one, my first point is that seeds per pod is not the same thing as yield, as you guys know. And producers don't get paid for the number of seeds per pod when it goes to crushing. You get paid for tons of canola, right? So that isn't really a metric that's important to growers. But the plants can also respond to low pollination by making extra flowers and branches. So they can change their allocation. They can make larger seeds, so you'd get a higher thousand seed weight, for instance. And then also the growth responses of these canola plants are governed by so many other things too. So they're governed by moisture and nutrients and pests, and a list of things as long as my arm. And all of those things might feed back into how pollination affects these plants. But we have almost no idea about how any of those effects go. Okay, and then my second point is benefits may be different depending on what variety you're using. So this is a study by Houdevens et al., and they did this in Germany back in 2013, which is probably why you don't recognize or you might not recognize any of these varieties they used. But these are 4 different varieties of oilseed rape they used, and if you look at the top 2, all of the black lines are about the same. So the pollination treatments they used were hand pollinated, where they went and pollinated flowers with a little paintbrush. Open pollinated, so they didn't touch them. Wind pollinated, so they put a cage so that only wind could get into there. And self pollinated is where they pollinated them only using flowers from that single flower. And they found that these ones didn't really care. So it may be that if you pollinated these varieties, it wouldn't make any difference at all. But in some, it may matter quite a lot. So in these 2 down here, ones that were self-pollinated had significantly lower yields. Now, my other point is that hybrid canola is less sensitive to self-pollination than traditional canola. And since hybrid is mostly what we're using over here, perhaps pollination isn't that important. So this is another study from Eric Lindstrom, who did this in Sweden, and they looked at hybrid versus open pollinated forms of canola, and they found that in open pollinated, you get a very large yield increase if you pollinate, whereas in hybrid, there's basically no difference at all. And then my last point here, or my point on this slide, is that more research has been done on traditional canola rather than hybrid canola. So again, this may be, I think we're probably leaning a bit more towards this circumstance. Now, one of the other points is the cost of honeybee pollination. So I went back to the Sabahi paper and I sort of back calculated based on what they were saying they got out of yields of what a grower could expect under the similar conditions. So this zero over here, they got 60 bushels per acre, which is pretty good for canola. And they found that in their highly pollinated plots, they got 87 bushels per acre. Now, that's quite an increase. And I found, and I looked at the difference in money that you would make between that, given that you have to pay beekeepers to move hives in, which are about $170 for a honeybee hive, that you'd make about 10 grand more on that field. Now, there are a lot of caveats to that. For one thing, there's a lot of spread in that data. So your field may be here, but your field also may not be. And given that I've yet to meet someone who's produced an 86 bushel per acre crop, then this seems less likely to me. So the average production for Alberta is about 40 bushels per acre. And at 40 bushels per acre, if you recalculate this, you actually make no money. So even if you do get a yield boost from this thing, you actually don't make any more money than you would from just leaving it alone. So this might be true at high yields, or if your field is just super, really, really nice. But I don't think the general populace would benefit from this. And furthermore, this is another plug. This is a plug for my own research. Even if you do stock them, I don't think the effect is going to be consistent across the fields. So this is number of honeybee visits per hour. So what me and my colleagues did was we tromped out into the middle of a canola field and sat there for 10 minutes watching how many honeybees were visiting the flowers in this area. And this is generally what we found. And we found that the pollination or the visitation decreases quite a bit as you go away from the honeybee hives. So maybe it would be that you would get yield benefits around the edges, but you would get certainly almost nothing around the center here. So, and this is just because honeybees aren't dumb. They don't want to, why would you go 500 meters when you could go 10? So they all just go to the ones at the edge of the field. And that's sort of another part of my research that I'm not going to talk about today. But the point that you should take from this graph is that pollination may not be the same at the center of your field as it is at the edge. So in summary, there's evidence that pollination can improve yield in commodity canola, but this isn't really that well studied for hybrid canola. And I'm actually doing a bit of a study on this, so if you invite me back next year, I'll be able to tell you in much more detail how it does. But at this point, adding managed pollination is probably not economically feasible for most growers. Which brings me to my last point, which is maintaining wild pollinator populations. And because this is free too, right? You don't have to take care of these bees. All you have to do is pay attention to them a bit. So the last part of my presentation is what can I do? So now my point one here is you have to think like a bee. So now you guys may be thinking, how do I know what a bee wants? Well, now we went through what all of these, what the life cycle of these bees is like, what they might want, and so what they might want in their life is probably a little bit more clear now. So the wild and managed pollinators require food, shelter, and then they also require stability. So they require year-to-year stability. That means if you have a canola field one year and then a wheat field the next year, in year one, you're going to have a bonanza, all of this pollen and nectar everywhere, and then in the next year, you're going to have nothing, right? And then they also require stability across the season, too. For instance, canola blooms generally from around like the last week of June to around sort of the last week of August, sort of in total. But what about bees that are earlier than that or later? They don't get anything, right? So that means that you need something that we need extra things. So here's just kind of an example of it. So if you have field one here where there's only canola, and field two where there's canola plus some other flowers in the ditches or things like that. Species one gets almost nothing. So the blue one here It's phenol. And these are the bee populations down here. Species 1, it gets hosed, right? It doesn't have anything to eat, except in this environment where it has a little bit of these other flowers that it can survive on as well as just the canola. So food supply is something to think about for wild bees. So early flowering plants like trees and currants and saskatoons, they're important. Also, weeds are sort of interestingly important too. So flowering, now, I'm not going to tell you when or how you should run your operation, but weeds are not as useless for bees as they may be for you. So things, and I mean grasses, yes. Grasses don't give anything to bees. But things like dandelions, that's actually quite helpful for early populations of bees. So a possible thing that you could do would be leaving corners unworked. So seeding them with native grass and flower mixtures, and also to keep cattle from overgrazing on pastures. Now, there's a couple studies that have come out from Spain that show that if you have huge amounts of grazing, you actually get lower bee diversity because the cattle are chopping the tops off of all the flowers. Okay, and then the other thing that you could think about is nesting habitat. So bare ground is actually surprisingly important to these guys, as well as trees and woody shrubs. So you can see this is one of my field sites over here, over between Coaldale and Tabor. And low-till methods, as we talked a bit about low-till methods. That's important too, because remember that they live, lots of the wild species live underground. And then spraying only when needed, right? So again, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you should or should not spray, but that's up for you to decide. But keep in mind to keep the economic thresholds in mind when you're spraying. Now here's a bit of just an example of what you might see. So this is a bare patch of ground here, and you can see all these little they look like ant nests almost coming out of the ground. Now each of those arrows is a single nest. So this is a piece of dirt, maybe only like a meter by a meter, right? And already we have 8 nests there, right? So these are halictid bees that are nesting there. So this is just a tiny little patch of ground that's immensely helpful to these. Or similarly, this is another one of my field sites down by Raymond. And these guys had this big patch. It was a slope that I think they couldn't cultivate it because the slope was too big. But this is all uncultivated, and this is it's kind of weedy, and you might think this is sort of useless land. But this is actually super helpful to wild bee populations because they can get forage from this, they can nest there, and then they can also visit in the canola when it's in bloom too. So in summary, farmland can provide some food and nesting habitat, but continuity of food and nesting habitat is also important, as well as just the canola bloom. And remember that most smaller bees can only fly a few hundred meters, so that kind of dictates that's the size of their world there. And so finally, I'd like to end off in this presentation by think like a bee, right? Because bees are farmers in a way too. They go out and they have to harvest their flowers every year too. And thank you very much for listening. If you want to talk to me about anything related to bees or canola pollination or anything like that, I'd be happy to talk to you. And at the back table there, under the Alberta wheat sign, I have a collection of wild bees that I've caught from around this area that you can come and look at. And I'd be happy to talk to you about any of that. And oh yes, and then one more thing. I also have copies of this at the back. These 2 books are free online, and they tell you these are guidelines for providing native bee habitat on your farms. Thank you very much. One or two quick questions?
In your field studies, I mean, obviously you battle with livestock and
Yep.
were those fields sprayed at all, and did that impact the value of the food?
Yeah, most of the fields we were in were sprayed. There were a couple that were not. Oh, right, of course. So the question was were the fields that I was in, were they sprayed? And I would say that most of them were sprayed. And you were saying, does that affect the value of the bees?
The value of the data that you got, was it impacted at all because you may have lost some bees to insecticide application, or?
Potentially. It depends. Spraying is kind of one of those wild cards. If you spray it when they're out, then that can be super bad for them. But it also depends on the pesticide you're using. If you spray at night, the bees all go back home at night, so that doesn't really affect them. But in general, I mean, they're insecticides, so they're meant to kill insects. So in general, spraying is not not good for bees. But I haven't specifically examined that question in my data, though. So.